you remembers in class when we found out that I was pretty much the only one in here that actually had a positive experience with lectures? Anybody remember that? Yes? No? Yeah. And I might be a freak. It's possible. But I'll tell you one thing. You're going to have kids like me in your classes. Maybe not every class you have, but most of them. You're going to have at least one kid like me. And that kid, I can tell you because I was that kid, will understand your lecture if your verbal communication is essentially functional. But if that kid can't understand what you're saying without resorting to nonverbal illustrations, visual aids, then no one in the classroom will understand you no matter what you do. You know, nonverbal communication is extremely important. It's necessary to make adequate verbal communication good enough for the classroom. But it's not capable of salvaging bad verbal communication. I want to talk a little bit about the book. The title of chapter 4 is Verbal and Nonverbal Communication. And if it's not clear, what verbal communication actually refers to is language, words, the formal structures that we use to make meaning. Not the inflection of the tones, necessarily, and certainly not visual aids, classroom arrangement, that kind of thing. Just the language. Now, there are 33 pages in chapter 4. Of those 33, only 3.5 actually discuss language. And none of the subtitles in the chapter actually have the word verbal in them without the word non in front of it. Of those 3.5 pages, 2 are spent sort of disparaging language as inadequate and confusing. And about another half a page is spent on what I personally felt to be a tangent about generalization. And there's a connection that's made between language and the ability or the tendency that people might have to make generalizations about their students and people that they work with. But it's really not a verbal point. And on the other page, there are really 2 lessons that they get across, which is to use positive rather than negative language. In other words, don't tell your children what not to do. Tell them what to do, or your students, I should say. Give them something affirmative to do or to respond to an instruction, not a rule to break, not a don't do this, a thou shalt not. And the other lesson that they teach is to clarify what time you mean. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, 5 minutes, an hour, a day. You know, be specific about those things. And those are good lessons. Those are important things to know. But they're also very obscure, arbitrary facets of this huge topic of verbal communication. And I think the real irony in that is that this is a book, this textbook. You know, it's scattered with a few tables and charts and illustrations of things, but it's mostly words. They're written on the page. It's verbal communication, telling you how inadequate verbal communication is. I'm a writer, so I have maybe a bias on the issue, but I also feel that it's true that you really can get a lot across verbally. Next up here, this is a section from a poem by Lewis Carroll, The Jabberwocky. Can I get a volunteer to read just that first stanza at the top out loud, please? Anybody? Come on. Go ahead, thanks.
Well, as brilliant and the swimming toes did gyre and gibble, gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the oragos and the bone rats outran.
Have you ever heard this poem before or read it before?
I've heard of it, yes.
Okay, well let me ask you, what impression do you get from that? What feelings does that elicit? What do you envision?
From that?
Yeah.
It's just meaningless words, really.
So, I mean, clearly there's not a right answer to that question, but does anybody have some sort of maybe a poetic feeling of where they are, of what they're doing? I mean, this is a very well-respected poem. Okay. Let's try the second. Does anybody want to read the second stanza? Yeah, go ahead.
Beware the Jabberwocky, my son, who jaws that bite the claws that catch. Beware the jab, the no bird, and shun the cleanliness and canvas snatch.
Now, these are the first 2 stanzas of the poem. So you've basically read two of the stanzas of this whole piece. Now, at that point, if you were reading the poem from start to finish and you stopped there, in your mind, and bearing in mind there's not an objectively right or wrong answer, where are you? What do you see? What do you think is going on? I mean, do you have a sense, even if it's vague, of the world that you're in, of a place that you are, or a place where the story is taking place? Is there any kind of sense of that at all? Okay. Well, maybe I should have put the whole thing up here.
They're all characters from Alice in Wonderland, so it's almost like a feeling of the Wonderland. In the first one, the mome rats are little creatures in Alice in Wonderland. The Jabberwocky and the Bandersnatcher in the second one. So it almost gives you a feel. If you knew that, it kind of gives you a feeling of being in Wonderland.
Well, I've actually never read Alice in Wonderland, personally. That's
You don't have to read it, it's in the movie. You've never seen it.
Well, I haven't seen that either. Thank you for pointing that out, though. But I have read this poem a number of times, and personally, I love this poem. The words don't mean anything. They're not words in our language. I mean, maybe some of these words, as she pointed out, do actually correlate to things in other pieces of fiction by Lewis Carroll, but to us, to the reader coming to this poem, they don't mean anything, but I love this poem. The only thing that I needed to get out of it in order to accomplish something that was worth accomplishing, I manufactured myself. You know, it's in the tone, it's in the pace, and now they don't tell you how to inflect it when you read. They don't tell you, you know, what anything means, but you have the freedom to build this meaning for yourself. And yet this is entirely verbal communication. But they're words that don't mean anything and a grammar that we don't use anymore. And that's an important thing too. Grammar is a huge function of verbal communication. Now, I don't think this illustration worked quite as well as I hoped it would, but you can get meaning out of something that has a grammar you're not familiar with, as long as it has a consistency and an accessibility that you can latch onto. And where you can apply this in the classroom, your kids are not going to speak the same parlance exactly that you do. Or your students, I keep saying kids, I shouldn't say that. You know, they might have more of a street thing going on. They might be, you know, you might be teaching in the South, you might be teaching in the Northeast. Yeah, you might be teaching anywhere, and you're not necessarily going to share that cultural, you know, linguistic dialect. But you can make yourself understood, and you can understand them, because it's not too far removed from what you speak to understand it. And more importantly, we have more of a general understanding of how our language works, a more general conception of it in our minds that we can apply to many situations.